Truthspresso, episode 164.
Face it, we all would rather sleep in this morning. That's why God gave us espresso, to kickstart our zombified corpses into hyperdrive. And now, giving your mind and soul the morning shot of truth it craves. This is Truthspresso with Daniel Minnick.
Well, hey, this is Daniel Minnick, the host for Truthspresso, coming at you with another episode of Truthspresso Express as I am driving to work in the morning, this Thursday morning. And as I am recording this is a few days after President Biden's State of the Union address. And so I listened to that State of the Union address, and I've listened to different rebuttals, the responses by the Republican governor of Iowa. I also listened to the response by Rashida Tlaib, the more socialistic Democrat who's also a member of a small kind of independent workers' party, and some thoughts from people like Ben Shapiro and company. And so, having listened to the President's State of the Union address, I would like to give my thoughts and my rebuttal to some of the things that he said. Now, I'd like to start off by just stating that if I were the president of the country delivering the State of the Union address at this time, I would probably start by saying things quite differently. If I were president, I would probably break precedent by saying that the State of the Union is weak or in shambles. Now, every president is always going to say the State of the Union is strong because they want to pitch their own performance, regardless of how good things appear to be economically or, morally or whatever. But, I would like to be completely honest and say that the State of the Union has never been worse. It's weak, it's in shambles because, we have lost our way, we have forsaken our God, we have forsaken the way God has designed nature and human activity to be in favor of things like tyranny and destroying the family structure, destroying human identity the way God has designed things to be. So I would definitely say that, and then I would say that we could have a stronger union, we could do better, and I would proceed to explain how and why and how. So that would be quite different from most of the presidents throughout history would give their State of the Union addresses. But, of course, I'm not the president, and of course, I'm demonstrating every reason why I would likely never be the president of the United States. But let me go over some of the things that President Biden has said in his State of the Union. As I recall, he made several points I read summaries of the points that he went through, try to get them fresh in my head. And so, when I recall the first significant portion of the State of the Union, he spent talking about the Ukraine conflict, and I understand that the script for the State of the Union address was originally written and then had to be changed and updated to possibly remove some parts and make room for talking about this Russia-Ukraine conflict that came up. I don't know if you'd say unexpectedly or not. Who knows what kinds of intelligence or, new things like this would possibly happen or likely happen, and didn't want to say anything, for whatever political reason. But Biden started off talking about the Ukraine conflict, and of course, regardless of how you view this thing, it's definitely one of those things that the current powers that be want to latch onto and to make the case that, hey, what are you protesting about? What are you complaining about? This should be a time to gather together and unite. They miss those old days where the American people were united after 9/11 and such. And, I myself don't like the kind of political unity that a lot of people are seeking, because it wants people to let down their guard, discard their principles, and unite around, some kind of elite power wanting to control things. And it usually results in people giving up their God ordained liberty and their freedoms. And yeah, that's what that kind of unity is. And and so it's like all about giving certain people unchecked power and, having the benevolent dictator that everyone loves. And, I was not much of a fan of the President George W. Bush there, and he did not govern really as a conservative. And so he, was big government on the so-called war on terror, and he was also big government in domestic programs with the Medicare Part D and No Child Left Behind and that kind of stuff. And it doesn't matter whether you're an R or a D, if you have power and you have all these people united behind you, often you're going to find yourselves compromising by meeting in the middle, and which really results in just, okay, we'll take the big government things you want and the big government things you want, and then we'll just support it all. Yeah, and so that's why I have a hard time with this type of unity. And, I will say that President Biden said in the State of the Union address that he's not planning to send U.S. troops there into harm's way. And so I would, appreciate that. I would hope that, we can hold him to that. But I would say that, he left us in a situation where Putin thought that he could get away with this kind of attack in Ukraine. And there's a lot of politics around this. I know that I would definitely say that, it was unprovoked, but there's politics behind why he did it that, a lot of people don't understand. It wasn't just, he just decided to invade Ukraine. There's the issue of the eastern regions and Russian loyalists and stuff like that. And he has this idea that Ukraine is rightfully, culturally a part of the great Soviet Union that used to be. So yeah, you could say that that Putin is a madman, but he has his reasons for things, whether they're good or bad. And of course, I would say they're bad, but under the current regime, under Biden's America, we have a lot of things that led up to this that, could have likely not resulted in this. And we were certainly more vulnerable to dependence on Russia, because the president mentioned the shared concerns over fuel prices. He mentioned, hurting at the pump. But yeah, you got to realize that fuel prices are not the only things that go up. Fuel prices affect every other price, because it takes fuel for trucks to deliver goods. It takes fuel for, so a lot of factories to manufacture things. And so fuel prices are not the only thing that has gone up. The prices of other commodities and groceries have gone up, in near proportion. And, he mentioned that putting sanctions on Russia would result possibly in, fuel prices going up faster, but he tried to encourage us that we could get through this and that we're prepared for it because, if I remember correctly, of course, just like several months ago when he mentioned the strategic petroleum reserve that he was, releasing like about 30 million barrels or so of oil from there. And he doesn't seem to understand just how much oil production, oil consumption is used commonly in the United States every day. Because on average, every day the United States uses about 19 to 20 million barrels of oil every day. And you might think that's a lot, but that's just the way things are run. And like if you want lots of people to die, you would cut that off. And so Biden announced, that he's working with our allies to avoid Russian oil and ramp up production there, that we're working with them for that. And he mentioned once again that he was going to tap into the strategic petroleum reserve for 30 million barrels of oil. And he seems to be so completely out of touch with what we really need, because if we were to rely solely on that, that would barely get us through 2 days of consumption if we even reduced our consumption. And that would be very difficult to do that. But, so obviously it's not going to be the, only thing that's consumed. So it could be spread out over, a few weeks, something like that. But if we were relying on that in any significant sense, we would be doomed, okay? But let's think about why we're in such a situation in the first place. So on the first day that Biden took office, in his inaugural day, he kept a campaign promise that he would shut down the Keystone Pipeline. So, he, in his commitment to get the United States toward zero net emissions, zero net carbon emissions, he would try to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, not foreign fossil fuels, but fossil fuels in general. And to make good on his promise, he shut down the Keystone Pipeline so that we locally here would produce less oil, distribute less oil, and also put, of course, people who'd work there out of a job. Thank you, President. But what did our gracious president also do? So he shut down the Keystone Pipeline locally here in the good old US of A, but he he supported opening up a pipeline from Russia to Germany. So it's okay for them to have an oil pipeline opened up to get oil from Russia to make Germany more dependent on Russian oil, but it's also necessary that we lead the world by closing the Keystone Pipeline so that we're more dependent on Russian oil. So if I recall, in 2019, the U.S. finally became a net producer of, energy there. But then now under Biden, we went back to being dependent on Russian oil. And then, of course, when you have something like this happen with Russia's attack on Ukraine, and we have all the inflation and supply shocks and forced reduction in oil production, bringing up prices, affecting prices everywhere. Then you have an attack from Russia on Ukraine that results in the fear that we could end up paying even more for oil because we're more dependent on Russian oil. We have this, and I would say too little too late there. There's plenty you could do. There's plenty we could do right now that would get us to switch to more, to be more more energy independent and start producing more oil here locally. There's been always campaigns to drill more. We can reopen the Keystone Pipeline. We could drill in Alaska, but the environmental lobbyists don't like that, and they're not going to let that happen. So they seem to be more in favor of keeping us dependent on foreign oil, because the United States is supposed to be a leader in in not producing fossil fuels, but we still consume it. It's just ridiculous. And of course, the push is always to go for more wind and solar and more electric vehicles, which of course we'll talk about in a little bit. Because, President Biden also mentioned at some point in his speech about trying to get several 100,000 charging stations for electric cars. And of course, that issue with electric cars as some means of reducing emissions is, laughable and could fill hours of discussion. But let me just briefly mention that this is not a good solution. This is a problem. So sorry, Mr. President, but, it's not a drop-in replacement if it were a replacement for the current situation. So what about electric vehicles? Well, you would have to have, millions of Americans, the cost of trading in their vehicles for electric vehicles. And of course, if you have a government-sponsored program to push electric vehicles, and all of a sudden you have this big demand for electric vehicles because it's being pushed by the government, the cost of electric vehicles, the laws of supply and demand, the cost of such vehicles would go through the roof. And most Americans are not going to be able to afford that. And then, of course, you'd have the government spending, trillions of dollars just to make sure that Americans would be able to trade in their vehicles for these expensive electric vehicles, which would then, end up ramping up the cost for it, because as you subsidize things, the costs go even higher up. And so Americans would be paying through the nose for these electric vehicles through taxes and spending, if not even partly through their own having to foot the bill out of their own wallets. But either way, it's not free to get this. But the electric vehicles are not the panacea that the president thinks that they are, because they don't necessarily help the environment. And first of all, let's just think of the infrastructure needed for this. So you'd have to have all these stations able to house chargers, and not every gas station is able to do this. And so just the construction alone would have to make it difficult for cars to be able to use the gas pumps, as gas stations are having to undergo construction to put these chargers in. Not all of them would be able to have the underground, capacity to deal with that. They're not able to deal with the needs for the construction, the infrastructure for that very easily. That's its own expense. Plus, how are you going to have all the chargers that people need for the kind of commutes that they do? You'd have to have lots and lots of chargers for every gas station, in America, which is not feasible. And then, because we still don't have electric vehicles up to par with the time sensitivity that Americans need for their commutes, because at best, especially for long commutes, it takes at least a half hour to charge, if I recall correctly, maybe 80 to 90%. And that's, that's on a good day. So it takes that, instead of being able to fill up in about 5 minutes or so, a 30-minute charge of, partially charging up the battery, that's not feasible. And then, so compound that with long lines at the pump or at the charging stations, and you have a real problem on your hands. So you think a lot of gas stations, they can get long lines, even when they have, say, 10 pumps available. So, one charging station's not going to cut it. 10 charging stations is not going to cut it. You would need a lot of real estate and the ability to put, so you need a lot of parking place, which will require a lot of laying out and, zoning and all kinds of stuff that the president hasn't thought of, to be able to accommodate all the charging stations and the amount of space for lines for charging stations that would be needed to reduce the amount of time for waiting in line. Plus, yes, you could have residential chargers. You can, if you have an electric vehicle, you can get a charger for home use, but not everyone owns a home with an attached garage. You're talking more about the suburbs, or when you're talking about the inner cities, these are the upscale, very wealthy people who can actually have a home with an attached garage, to hide the charger. Otherwise, you have all these people with extension cords running out of their houses, in residential areas. And of course, that would be a recipe for, disaster. Think of how many people would sneak out and want to park their car and then unplug someone's charger to plug into their own car, someone's extension cord, and so on like that. That would be a disaster. Well, then you say, well, let's build all these residential charging stations near apartment complexes. Yeah, same problem with gas stations, same problem with the inability to retrofit them into most residential areas that are not built and ready for that kind of thing. And then the construction would make it very difficult for people to be able to park their vehicles near their apartments and so on. So yeah, you have to think about these types of things. That's reason why we can't just whole hog embrace electric vehicles. Plus, there's the problem with the fact that, how do you produce that much electricity? Merely charging batteries themselves, there's the issue of landfills and batteries running out of charge, and needing to be replaced. And what do we do with them? How do we recycle them? And then, producing enough electricity for most Americans or all Americans to drive electric vehicles, that's a lot of electricity. How does it get produced? Well, there's not enough, wind turbines and, water and stuff to produce these, the electricity for these vehicles. And so, if you think wind and solar is going to be enough to supply the amount of electricity needed for all these electric vehicles, you're dreaming. And think about, okay, solar. Well, do we have the infrastructure to produce solar-powered panels, but with, solar panels? Do we have a solar-powered infrastructure that would help us to produce solar-powered equipment with solar power so that it would be green? No, we would have to use a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure to produce the solar panels needed and to replace the solar panels needed, using fossil fuels. So we'd see a lot of fossil fuels ramp up production and be diverted to making solar and wind equipment. Yes, I know, admit I'm not an engineer, but I have listened to interviews with people who are experts in this field in wind and solar power, so secondhand information, I've heard this somewhere, okay? So yeah, there is no drop-in replacement. Solar and wind would have to be produced using fossil fuels, and you'd have to figure out a way to make wind and solar that would meet current energy demands and be able to produce wind and solar equipment using wind and solar power, and that's just not happening. What about wind power? Relying on wind and solar is something that just cannot be done 24/7. And also wind power, think of all the wind turbines that would be needed. Now we see all those grand pictures of wind turbines in the bread baskets of America. And yeah, we have some good wind power locations in America. But to get the kind of wind power that the green people are talking about would require, an awful lot of real estate for that. Not all real estate is suited for wind power, and to make it suited for wind power requires a lot of, leveling of land, which would of course would require a lot of fuel, fossil fuel consumption for that construction process, and then putting all the wind turbines in, that requires a lot of wind tunneling and dedicating an awful lot of real estate that could be used for, say, growing crops, because, any wind turbine area, it requires flatlands, it requires lots of wind tunneling to blow these turbines, so basically you end up with an arid area that's not suited for crop production, so we would have to use up a lot of real estate that couldn't be used for crop production to produce wind energy, and so yeah, food prices would soar, and there's simply not enough land, just land alone, for wind turbines, and we have to rely on the wind happening as needed because wind power is just simply not up to par for this. So, what do we often forget about in all this push for green stuff is nuclear power. And of course, the first thing that comes to your mind is that Japanese nuclear plant that exploded. But compared to fossil fuels and innovations in nuclear power, the likelihood of that actually happening is significantly lower than the nuclear power rejecting green pundits would have you to believe. And the proof for that is that there are European countries, for example, France has at least 70% of their power, their energy running on nuclear power. So they prove that nuclear power is feasible. But of course, the green pundits, the environmentalists in the United States aren't keen on nuclear power. They're going to scaremonger because they don't like the fact that nuclear power is a good solution toward what they want, but they don't want a good, easy solution. They want something that requires us to give up our freedoms and our treasure to a Green New Deal or such that would make all kinds of promises that it would just make lots of jobs, and there's really no cost to it. It's just the oil companies that are being greedy, and so we could move to wind and solar if it weren't for them getting in the way because they don't like challenges to their oil monopolies. But the truth is far from that. The truth is that wind and solar is not up to par, and trying to just whole hog, this quick in a decade type of thing that the Green New Deal proponents want for wind and solar would just simply result in mass starvation. Their promises that they make cannot simply be kept. All it would be is a move toward a, an energy dictatorship where, there'd be mass starvation and death, and giving up liberties in favor of energy czars that simply would not be able to produce the energy needed for food and health care. And they'll make all the promises in the world, but they do not understand energy or the environment. And unfortunately, I've parked here at work, so I will continue talking about Biden's speech, State of the Union speech, as I drive home from work. Today, that's my plan.
If the practice principle is vital for teaching such morally neutral task as tying shoes, how much more important is it for training children in Christ-like character?
This is Yvette Hampton, host of the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. Join us each week for a new episode as we offer encouragement and resources on biblical discipleship from popular speakers and authors, as well as parents just like you and me. Find out more at schoolhouserocked.com or listen anywhere you find your favorite podcast.
Hey there! Once again, this is Daniel Minnick, your host for Truthspresso, and this is Truthspresso Express, and I am driving home from work on this Thursday evening. As of this recording, I am doing part 2 of my analysis of President Biden's State of the Union speech. So the last part, I talked about the Ukraine conflict a little bit, and I also talked about the president's lack of understanding about energy and the costs of energy and what really is the solution. And he seems to think, as I've heard him say many times, that we can just somehow work our way into using electric cars, and he's boasted about proposing solutions to get several 100,000 charging stations installed in the country. And of course, I talked about how that is completely not feasible, how the reason we don't have electric cars in use in the United States on a wide scale, is because of the limitations and the problems, and how if we were to be forced to go to electric vehicles, that would absolutely grind the economy to a halt, which would ultimately result in mass starvation. But of course, idealist demagogues don't understand that. So now the president also talked about how he was fighting inflation. And of course, he doesn't want to accept that he and his policies and those who promote those his policies are to blame for inflation. No, I'm not going to say that they are fully to blame for it, because even President Trump beforehand, with the pandemic spending, that caused a lot of money printing, and also the lockdowns, which, yes, I admit that a lot of them were enforced by regionally by mayors and governors and so on, and President Trump didn't really have a federal lockdown policy. And I remember reading articles claiming that people were complaining that they wanted a federal lockdown policy, and I have to be incredibly thankful that didn't happen. But yeah, President Trump was responsible for a lot of spending and the seeds for inflation that happened in 2020. And yeah, President Biden did not reverse that policy. In fact, he wanted to continue it and then propose and sign new spending initiatives, including a over $1 trillion infrastructure bill. And then he also wanted to push for a $2 trillion Build Back Better bill. And you just think, why is it that these Democrats seem to think that government spending actually reduces inflation? But that's what he tried to claim. He tried to talk about how he was fighting he was fighting inflation, but he showed no understanding of what it is, what causes it, and how to fight it. And a while ago, I did have some episodes of Truthspresso kind of walking through economics from a biblical and liberty-minded perspective, and I did define what inflation is and how the definition in the dictionary, just like the definition of, racism and, marriage and stuff, has changed over time. Well, likewise, the definition of an inflation changes over time from the actual act of creating new money as the cause, that itself is the inflation and it results in rising prices. But the new economics wants to try to claim that just rising prices itself is inflation, but prices can rise from supply shocks without technically or hypothetically a change in the supply of money. Why would you call that inflation? And of course, the purpose is to get you to look the other way and think that there really is no connection between spending and debt and money production and inflation. Well, if you increase the supply of money without somehow, having the supply of goods and services increase alongside it, then you end up with inflation. And usually when you have a monopolistic creation of the money supply with spending. So it's interesting that President Biden is so confident that his trillions of dollars of spending are somehow going to actually fight inflation. He emphasizes that a lot. And so, just, look, like even assuming that government spending were like business investment, just because someone puts up capital doesn't guarantee that it's actually going to be profitable. And when it comes to government spending monopoly, you end up with prices being bid up for contractors, you end up with a lot of waste, and so you're going to end up with a lot more inflation. But the president chided corporations for greed. I've seen that a lot, even from the Rashida Tlaib response, that somehow, inflation is really just an illusion for all of a sudden a bunch of corporations just decide to get greedy together at the same time. And of course, I want to ask the question, wait, aren't they greedy all the time in your view? Why do they just seem to get collectively more greedy, like just massively more greedy at the same time in certain convenient parts of the economic cycle or during, more trying times? Like maybe there's such a thing as printing too much money, spending it and giving it to your lobbying friends, and, not enough supply and stuff caused by lockdowns and stuff, meaning more money chasing fewer goods and services that makes the cost go up. Maybe supply and demand is actually a thing from Economics 101, but of course politicians and someone like Biden, who's been in the government for decades and not really with any real, completely out of touch exposure to actual work, doesn't really understand how things like this actually happen in the real world. He also he said that it was critical that, Congress accept his Federal Reserve nominations to the Federal Reserve Board, and that it was critical that they do that in the help to fight inflation. Well, his nominations to the Federal Reserve Board are not exactly inflation-fighting hawks. In fact, they said that, Powell himself has said that we should forget the whole idea that inflation is transitory. We need to remove that from our vocabulary and accept that inflation is here to stay for several years, for the foreseeable future. And okay, we're facing inflation now, measuring it about, 7% conservatively to, as much as 15% if you measure it with historical methods. And, the highest inflation of about 40 years when you you compare, like, how did we fight inflation, or at least what was one of the tools for fighting inflation 40 years ago when you had 1979, 1980 with similar similar inflation rates? Well, you had Fed Chairman Paul Volcker. As much as I detest the Federal Reserve, he actually saw the writing on the wall, and to fight, 15% inflation, he raised interest rates to 20%. But, what do we have now? Oh, talks about raising a quarter, a half, maybe up to 2%, from zero up to 2% over the course of maybe a year or two. And you have to ask the question, well, if inflation is at 7 to 15%, most likely, just exactly how is a quarter to 2% interest rate supposed to fight 15% inflation, huh? We need another Paul Volcker, at least that mindset. We need someone who actually understands economics and math. President Biden urged Congress to increase the federal minimum wage to 15%. You have this fight for 15 thing, and with inflation that we have now, eventually it might not become that far-fetched to have a federal minimum wage of 15%. I mean, we have a lot of low-skilled jobs inching upward toward that without a federal minimum wage needing to, guarantee that companies that are desperate for work will actually pay people close to that amount now. So forcing wages up will decrease inflation? How does that work, Mr. President? He blames inflation on supply shortages, but what are some of the causes of supply shortages? Well, there's not as much labor. You had less work, resulting in less labor, resulting in less output. And what does the president want to do? He wants to put upward pressure on labor prices, which would then put upward pressure on the ability to hire people and get work done. So if you have less work, what do higher wage floors cause? They cause less work. And remember, the cost of labor is another price in the market. People like President Biden don't seem to understand that labor incurs another price. It's not some other thing in the market. The cost of labor is another price on the market, just like the cost of apples and oranges and computers. So when you have things like inflation where the price of apples and gas and stuff is going up, the president thinks that, to fight that, we just need to push the price of labor up. That's not going to help the price of gas and apples and so on to go down if you push more prices up. All you're going to do is ensure that the prices likely get pressure to go up even more. So with a coercive increase in a minimum wage, and I know I could make the argument that we should just totally abolish the minimum wage, but for now, let's just say that we don't increase it. Now, an increase in the minimum wage forcing the idea that someone who wants to work and someone who wants to pay for labor cannot legally agree on an arrangement unless it's for at least a certain price. Well, then the cost of labor goes up, and then companies who will find ways to cut costs. Perhaps they'll automate. Perhaps, they'll only hire people who demonstrate that they have special skills for the job, and then others who are only worth lower skilled labor will be out of luck. They won't be able to get hired. So their cost of living goes up as they're making no income, and the cost of labor in general goes up, which would ultimately result in passing those costs on to the consumer. So, as I said before, on the contrary to President Biden's plan for countering inflation and expecting to be able to increase the minimum wage, it can put pressure on other prices because an increase in the cost of labor would result in even more increases in the prices of the output of labor because of the price of labor going up. Meanwhile, those who can't get a job because companies can't afford to hire them at the new minimum wage would have to deal with zero income against increasing costs of living. So here's my proposed solution. Stop thinking that the government can fix problems that are caused by government with yet more government. If you really want to fight inflation, because inflation is a monetary phenomenon caused by a government monopoly on spending and increasing the supply of money, how about you reduce deficit spending, reduce taxes, reduce welfare payments for people to stay home, reduce regulations on the economy, allow the free market to work. I guarantee you that if you just trust people to make exchanges on the market mutually without the government getting in the way, you will get more produced with less money being created, and that will result in lower prices, and it will result in higher standards of living for everyone. And never implement a lockdown again for any reason whatsoever. There. That's my solution to fighting against inflation and preventing yet more supply shocks or, more reasons for inflation. Well, I am getting close to home. I'm about to arrive at home, so that unfortunately will bring an end to this part, but I am going to continue because there's a lot more to talk about in the State of the Union. We've got to get to the president's talk about handling the pandemic and also his jabs at Big Pharma, and I am certainly no fan of Big Pharma, but I will say that his policies are certainly not consistent. What's good for the goose and what's good for the gander. And so stay tuned for the next part of Truthspresso Express covering the State of the Union address.
The Christian Podcast Community is a cohesive group of like-minded Christian podcasters proclaiming the truths of Christ with expertise and passion in the areas of theology, church history, Christian living, evangelism, apologetics, parenting, homeschooling, sermons, and much, much more. So check us out at christianpodcastcommunity.org. christianpodcastcommunity.org. One stop for all your favorite Christian podcasts.
Hey friends, Daniel here, heading to work this Friday morning of this recording for another part of a Truthspresso Express, responding to President Biden's State of the Union address. When I last left off, I believe I was talking about the minimum wage, wanting to raise it to $15 an hour. Now, let me just briefly talk about the problem with the minimum wage. Let's say you had no minimum wage. Does that mean that, employers would pay people $0? Well, think about this scenario. So let's say some company decided to hire people for $0, like it's just abject voluntary slavery. And then some enterprising employer comes along and says, let's see, I can get all the labor if I just offer a penny per hour. They'll want to work for me for sure, because a penny per hour is mathematically infinitely more than zero if you multiply it out or whatever. And then another enterprising employer comes along and says, hey, I could double that. I could get the labor if I offer 2 pennies per hour. And then another one comes along and says, well, hey, I can raise it to 3, and so on. And, you see how this works. So without a mandatory minimum wage, there used to be such a time in history, and people still got paid, and they weren't paid almost nothing to crawl around in the dirt and get their limbs blown off, and so real wages were low in the past, mostly because things weren't as productive as you actually have to invent and produce, and the more you invent and produce, the more efficient things get, the more you can afford to pay people higher because they're more productive, and so on. That's how an economy naturally evolves. Now, at some point, there will become more of a equilibrium because, as I said, supply and demand. Labor has its supply and demand, and money has its supply and demand. The need for producing things and how much you could sell them for, has its own supply and demand. So there's nothing exempt from the laws of supply and demand. Now, how often have you ever seen, like, the general public protest because the price of apples was not high enough? Like, we demand that the price of apples be higher. We demand that apples be at least $1.50 per apple. And it may come to that eventually with inflation, who knows? But, like, have you ever seen general public protest that the price of apples is not high enough? Well, you think, okay, most likely, if anything, if things were to happen or there's supply shortages and the cost of apples went up, people would protest that the price of apples were too high. But, only if you saw a bunch of people working for apple pickers protesting that the price of apples were not high enough, you would understand that, but you would say, hey, that's just a special interest. But you see a lot of people in the general public protesting that the price of labor, the price of unskilled labor, isn't high enough. But labor is a service, it's a good, basically on the market, subject to supply and demand, and there is no justice price for unskilled labor that isn't subject to the laws of supply and demand, just like any other product, whether it's part of the supply chain, up on the supply chain, or toward the bottom in the storefront, or services or goods or whatever. It's all subject to supply and demand. And so the minimum wage is technically not needed at all. In fact, it's legal extortion. Now, let's move on to the president talking about the pandemic, the virus, and how they handle it and how we're getting beyond it. I would have liked for him to explain how the United States has close to 1 million documented deaths from the virus, but worldwide there are about 6 million documented deaths from the virus. And, if you don't run the math, all you're thinking about is how much of a tragedy that is, which indeed it is, but I want to emphasize how much more of a tragedy it is for the good old US of A. Because we have 1 out of 6 virus deaths were in the United States. So if you calculate it out, it's about 16% of virus deaths were in the United States. But what about the population of the United States? How does that compare to the global population? Well, The United States has about 4% of the global population. So why, Mr. President, does the U.S. have over 4 times the global average for the virus deaths? Why is it that we have about over 16%, close to 17% actually, of virus deaths, but only 4% of the world's population? That's about 4 times as many deaths of the average global population for the virus as there is in the United States. Doesn't that show that the policies that are primarily coming out of the U.S. and being pushed on the world by the U.S. are not working? At the very least, not working. At worst, they're actually causing more of the deaths. And these policies emphasize jabs, and they suppressed repurposed drugs for early treatments. So why is it that there were more deaths in 2021, or even in the months of 2021 that would correspond with the months of 2021, March to the end of the year 2020, before there was a jab available? But then once the jab was available and you had the policies trying to push it and even force it on people in 2021, why were there more deaths from the virus in 9 months of 2021 than in 9 months of 2020? Why is there no explanation for that when the president clearly said in his speech that the jabs were effective? Why is it that African countries that make hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin more available to people, and people were taking them prophylactically, they were taking them as a preventative measure, why do they have much lower death rates from the virus than the United States did? Is there anyone going to explain that? Or do we just ignore that because we have an agenda to push jabs and masks and not actually do early treatment for the virus until, of course, our friendly Pfizer creates some kind of early treatment pill that is, of course, patented and costs more than the repurposed drugs that doctors like Dr. Peter McCullough testified and demonstrated and actually used to treat people with proven results. Early treatment of the virus with a cocktail of repurposed drugs. You have hydroxychloroquine, you have ivermectin, you have doxycycline, you have azithromycin, you have vitamin C and vitamin D and quercetin. You have all kinds of these things in proportion depending on the time frame, depending on weight. It's the doctor and the patient doing early treatment here. But the policy early on with the virus was basically there is no known treatment. Hey citizen, hey doctor, there is no treatment for this until someone comes to the hospital in dire straits, and then we have treatment. And then you could do something like, then we'll push something like remdesivir. But why is it that the highly jabbed countries like the U.S. and Israel and Gibraltar, and Israel was basically the playground, the contractual playground for Pfizer and their jabs, and they'd get early access to the jabs, and they would be the ones in the lead for booster shots? Why is it that they had higher case rates and eventually higher hospitalization rates, and eventually they could not propagandize their way out of the fact that they'd have higher death rates, and you couldn't blame it on the minuscule people who didn't get the jab, who were trying to figure out how to navigate life without getting the jab. You can't blame it on all these invisible people who there's not very many of them there. So eventually we're going to have some splaining to do about this. Now, the president mentioned that Pfizer's recently produced more, early treatment pills for the virus. He didn't say the name, but I looked it up. These are called Paxlovid, and it's basically two different drugs together, and he purchased more of these than any other country. So, thrill, yeah, we, as always, we're in the lead for treating the virus, and yet we're not doing very well compared to African countries with our treatment. Because, we had suppression of the various drugs that I mentioned before. But let's make some comparison here with something else he said. He complained about Big Pharma, that he wants to stick it to Big Pharma because, insulin, and he had a young boy and his father there, and they suffer with diabetes, and, and he appealed to the idea that fathers wish that they could be good fathers because they've got to be able to treat their children, but it costs them too much. Hey, I'm on board with that. I agree. I don't like Big Pharma monopolizing insulin, and he mentioned that it costs $10 a vial, but Big Pharma charges 30 times more for that. How do they do that? Where's the competition? Maybe it's because the FDA actually allows that to happen. Maybe it's a legal monopoly. And where does the legal monopoly come from? The government. And, we could, if we just allowed more competition, and rather than just say, we need some kind of government-sponsored health care to force prices down or subsidize paying for it. That'll bring the price down. It'll increase the price, but spread that increased price among the population, the single-payer method. But he failed to realize how his Big Pharma Fauci regime has fought against the cheap and repurposed and effective early treatment for the virus, as I mentioned before. Because normally, before the war against early treatment, you could get HCQ and IVM and others for like $10 a pop, the cost of the wholesale cost of insulin. But let's see, what does the regime charge for their treatment after they don't do early treatment and force people to come into the hospitals with severe conditions, and then they'll treat them intravenously with a drug called remdesivir. Well, guess what? Remdesivir costs about $10 a dose for its toxicity that shouldn't even be administered. And what do hospitals charge? Because Big Pharma charges the hospitals over $3,000 per dose of something that costs them $10 to make. But yet we don't hear anything about that. And anyone who dares fight against Big Pharma on this front, the same regime who complains about insulin costing too much because of Big Pharma, won't allow, the known repurposed drugs for early treatment of the virus, but they will praise remdesivir in the hospital that was known to kill about 50% of the patients in the clinical trials before the virus, and yet that's what we're going to use, and we actually have people being harassed by the hospital if they refuse to take remdesivir. So we're willing to let Big Pharma charge over 300 times for this poison, while we complain that they charge 30 times for insulin, and there are solutions to that, but we don't want to hear it. We don't want to allow the free market to work. The president mentioned assault rifles with high-capacity magazines. Of course, his knowledge of so-called assault rifles is non-existent, and, he said that this wouldn't infringe the Second Amendment, that it saves lives. Well, yeah, because, they don't want it to infringe. The Second Amendment, says nothing about what qualifies as people being armed. But the president joked because he says that deer didn't need to wear protective military grade vests, but of course this demonstrates what he doesn't understand about gun ownership and the Second Amendment. It has nothing to do with protecting hunting. Now, hunting is, a byproduct of it, but it always had to do with the freedom of the people not to fear their government. It had to do with protecting the people against tyranny, and it has to do with a voluntary militia. Of course, he also mentioned the so-called need for the right to choose. Now, he just kind of mentioned that in passing, but it's clear that he mentioned that in light of the bill in Congress that, was at least shot down for now in the Senate. But Rashida Tlaib, in her more socialist response, mentioned that, we need to support a bill being passed in Congress that is somehow immune from any Supreme Court. Now think about that. Isn't the Supreme Court, at least by their role, supposed to determine whether bills passed by Congress are constitutional? How can you just pass a bill that's somehow immune from the Supreme Court? And the Constitution, of course, says nothing about abortion. It says nothing about the right to kill unborn children. Now, what the Constitution and the Bill of Rights does say, it says Congress shall write no law about certain things respecting an establishment of religion, prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the right of freedom of the speech or of the press, and the right to assemble. That is what's protected from laws of Congress, and that's what's enshrined in the Constitution. Also, the right of the people against warrantless searches and seizures without just cause, without probable cause, and how warrant should issue. So things about so-called hate speech and the ability to search people, digitally or whatever, that is unconstitutional, but it seems like we want to support those things which are clearly in violation of the Constitution, but then claim that abortion somehow needs to be enshrined in the Constitution when it clearly isn't, because abortion is the murder of the unborn. It's the murder of human beings. Like, why is everything upside down when it comes to these idealistic Democrats? He also, of course, mentioned transgender rights and that he has their back. Okay, what about young children? That I was listening about a recent case where there was a custody battle, and of course the judge ruled in favor of the mother who wanted to force her son to undergo surgery and drug treatments to become a girl, as it were. That, of course, it doesn't technically make you a girl, and the father was fighting against that. Now he's running, for a local office, because he's trying to save his son from this mutilation when a 7-year-old boy doesn't know enough. There's reasons why 7-year-olds can't make choices about, different things that we recognize in law, but for some reason, if they have these ideas, or at least, maybe adults who want things to happen will interpret things, like, say, if a boy, happens to play dolls or puts a wig on top of a parent's head or something like that, then, that proves that he wants to be a girl. He's really a girl trapped inside a boy body, and therefore we have to help him out with, drug treatment and surgery. And he said, so the president said he has their back. He also, toward the end, once again called to get rid of the Senate filibuster and pass the so-called Voting Rights Act. Now, I just parked at work, and so, there's not I'll just say a little bit. there's a lot more that can be said about this. It's the political posturing months ago about, Jim Crow and stuff, all to present an ID. But, like before, they were all in favor about, cities like New York and LA and so on implementing jab passports. And so, like, if they wanted everyone, they pushed, their patience was wearing thin, they wanted everyone to get jabs and, prove it to get into restaurants and so on. Why is it so difficult for someone who actually is a citizen to have some form of ID? You can get an ID that isn't a driver's license, and all you got to do is bring, even to vote. A lot of states or cities, they have things like proof of payment of a utility bill. Like, they're trying to go out of their way to make sure that you can vote as long as you prove that you're actually a citizen there. And if we have a jab card or something, then you can present that. Like, all it is that you've got to show that you're actually a real person, or that you actually have citizenship. This is nothing to discriminate against minorities or handicapped or whatever. The so-called Voting Rights Act just wants to make it easier for undocumented immigrants and stuff to be able to vote, because they know that the Democrats offer welfare and free stuff for them while not holding them accountable to the law. Like, undocumented immigrants can come in and they're not forced to get jabs and so on, but they can get free health care and welfare and stuff, and so they know where the votes would be going, and that's why they want this type of thing. Biden also pleaded for the Equality Act to arrive on his desk. Now, the Equality Act is absolutely destructive, and Chelsea and I did 3 episodes on how utterly catastrophic that would be. Now, he ended by mentioning funding the police, securing our borders, and fixing the immigration problem. This was another thing to try to unite. It tried to appeal to more conservative people. These things that he said sounded like Trump talking points, and if Trump said these exact same words in a State of the Union speech, he would have been lambasted for racism and ethno-nationalism in the news after the speech. But of course, Biden could say it and get away with it, but his words really mean nothing, because his actions prove that he has done nothing and intends to do nothing really about those. He's just trying to score points and perhaps improve his his rating for people who will take him at his word and not judge him by his actions. Now, of course, there are other things, but I've got to put this down, and that will be the end of the response to the State of the Union address. And I would say that as Christians, let's fight for truth. Let's not be fooled. Let's hold people accountable for their actions. As the Bible says, by their fruits you shall know them. A man can say he has faith, but, if his works don't demonstrate his faith, then that so-called faith is dead. The words that claim it are dead. We can apply that to things like campaign promises, and so I pray that God has mercy on our nation, and as James White said, even after 9/11, as people were shouting, "God bless America," he said, "God bless America with repentance." And that's what I pray here, because this State of the Union address demonstrates someone who doesn't understand truth, doesn't understand God's law, doesn't understand morality, doesn't understand economics. It's nothing but destruction. And it's nothing but it's nothing but Satan's delusions. And so, likewise, I iterate, God bless America with repentance.
Thank you for waking up with Truthspresso. Good morning, and God bless your day.
Hey friends, Daniel Minnick here again. If you liked waking up to this episode of Truthspresso, I would really appreciate it if you would rate it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or whatever application you use to listen to Truthspresso.